the Regal, B.B. King, a classic musician. And we are, in the last couple of days, guys, we have been going through basically an award tour of classic musicians. Ray Charles, Elvis Presley, Brian Wilson. We're hitting all kinds of the standards, and we haven't done B.B. King yet. So here's another person who is very influential, and we're getting some touch points right here. Live at the Regal, a live album from the mid-'60s. Let's go ahead and set the clock right now. I got it set. Matt, let's have you kick it off. First impressions, B.B. King live at the Regal.
My biggest takeaway from this is that if I ever argue with Sherry, I'm just going to not go upside her head, which was a piece of advice from B.B. King, that he's like, hey, fellas, don't ever go upside her head. So I was like, that's a good, all right. I didn't know.
The audience reaction to that, by the way, how knowing it was also very interesting.
Because she'll just get smarter, isn't that what she?
Yeah, he'll just get smarter. Yeah.
And it doesn't change anything, by the way. Yeah. So at least he was sending a good message of anti-domestic violence.
I love this album, and it's just great. It's a lot of it's even though it's the blues, right? Straight up blues.
Straight up.
And I think I might have commented on another episode how I think we talked about like me probably preferring R&B over the blues, and I still think that that's true. But I'm usually not so like, if I hear like a straight up blues album, it's not my favorite. But I really did like this. It's a great. I love his guitar tone. I think I have to first say that, and that coupled with his vocals, because his voice is outstanding.
Matt, I agree.
His vocals are so powerful. There's a couple of parts where he's just belting it out, and I'm like, yeah, I want to start, because that's the other thing too. You hear the audience like cheering him on in the background, which we kind of got that in James Brown and the James Brown Live at the Apollo album.
This is much better.
Yeah, while that was overbearing because that was like nonstop, this was kind of here and there, so it wasn't as annoying. Yeah, and the crazy thing for me is the blues, it's the same song, right? You break it down, all these songs are basically the same structure, yet these artists find ways to make it, new, unique, versatile, and it does have a sameness quality to it, but there's enough different things that are thrown on here that keep it interesting and make the song sound different. So I'm always amazed by that with the blues, because it's just a very straight up structure, but it can be done in so many different ways to make it sound unique. And the other main takeaway I took away from this was how Primitive Radio Gods, and now I know where Primitive Radio Gods got that vocal part and that standing outside of broken telephone booth. Baby. Yeah, I was like, I know that. What is that from?
Oh, that's from this?
Since the day.
Yeah.
Well, that's because he's singing that in I forget what the name of the song is. I have it written down here, but So I thought that was like, oh, there you go. So Primitive Radio Gods. There you go. That's like the longest song title I've ever heard of. It's ridiculous, but
I wonder.
Yeah, but this was a lot of fun, and I think I'll leave it at that for right now and hear from you guys.
I thought this album was great. This is how you do a live album. I love the use of the crowd noise. It wasn't overdone, like Matt said, and I love also his talking in between the songs, like really giving the audience a show. It made me feel like I was there. He sounds great. I always think of B.B. King as an old man, so it's always great to hear him in his prime, and these artists in general in their prime. I just looked. He was 39 when this album came out. So this is clearly like, that's why his voice sounds so great. He's probably standing, as I think he was sitting a lot when he was older, when he was playing music. So he's probably up moving around more and really just putting on a show. And this is like him at his peak, and blues sounding the best that they can sound, in my opinion. And all of the songs were really enjoyable. There's not any that really stood out to me. They're just like one fun song after another, and the crowd being into it really enhanced the songs for me. I did think it was a little weird to end on the song Help the Poor, especially since the song before, You Done Lost Your Good Thing Now, was such like a final song, almost like an encore song. It was so like uproarious and bombastic, and then it like kind of ended on this weird, somewhat more restrained mellow song. So that was one weird thing about the album. But
musically maybe, but it makes sense thematically, because when you think of the blues, right, and like Robert Johnson and stuff like that, it makes sense that your last song would be a universal idea rooted in hard times and overcoming hard times. And especially when you think of who's in the audience at that time, I'm sure it resonates, you know what I mean, to have a greater idea behind your own personal struggles. That's my take, at least. Yeah, especially when you listen to the lyrics of that song.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's probably accurate. But you get all the blues, you get all the blues themes in a nutshell in this album. Love, love lost, heartache, fighting with your significant other,
and just the blues, right? Don't they?
Yeah.
I got the blues. Like that's just how it starts off.
Yep. Yeah. Every day I have the blues. In fact.
Yeah.
So.
I love it how they just say we're singing the blues and we're just talking about the blues and it's blues music. It's just like the repetitive nature of it, but it still sounds great.
Do you guys know?
Go ahead.
I'm done. Do you know where the Regal is? I didn't look that up.
It's in Chicago, I think.
It's in Chicago,
okay.
Yeah.
So there you go. Oh, yeah, live at the Regal Theater in Chicago.
Yep, excellent. A stage that would eventually be defiled by the Blues Brothers, which someone will have to explain to me that idea. That must have been, yeah. So
wasn't B.B. King in the Blues Brothers? I think he was. In the movie, I mean.
I'm sure they aped that on there, but I'll move away from that. So yeah, I love this album. I looked at this as a continuation of the live albums that we've listened to in the 60s. And it's this, I looked, it's very similar to the James Brown album. You can say whatever you want about the content of the James Brown album, but they share a lot in common in terms of the structure of the show. And the fact that people just want it, like you could tell, they want it to be there. I actually think it shared more in common with the James Brown album than it did the Sam Cooke album. Maybe musically it shared elements of the same in terms of how it sounded, but Sam Cooke was basically presenting as like an idol, right? Where B.B. King was sort of presenting as a man of the people. I think it shared a lot in common with the Elvis album that we did, all the way down to having some social conscious songs and a vulnerability. That was the thing I noticed lyrically with this. There's a lot of vulnerability in these songs that doesn't always permeate in R&B and Motown and soul. It's interesting. It's a nuanced thing, but there's a universality in the blues, like where you kind of own your own decisions, I would say, and you own your own grief in a way that you don't in sort of like the sad sack songs that are more R&B and soul of the era, I would say. There's always an element of like self-blame and I mean, even like the song titles, right? That we cover right there. It's My Fault, right? I think is one of the songs on here. And yeah, I really liked it. As Matt said, this thing that stood out immediately is guitar tone. I mean, my God, you can see why all of the, if you go with who has great guitar tone later, right? We'll start with Eric Clapton, who's always talked about with that. And obviously Eric Clapton was deeply influenced by B.B. King. But you see a generation of blues guitar players, and it's so easy to see how he influenced a generation of players. But yeah, I love the lyrics of these songs. I love the pacing of it. I think the song selection was great. And yeah, it was a real nice slice into, if I felt the Ray Charles album didn't do as much to show me, or maybe the James Brown album, it didn't kind of transcend the experience for me, even if I kind of got it. I feel like this one falls into the same thing with the Elvis album, where it's like, okay, this lets you know exactly why this guy is who he is.
I agree. Yeah, I feel like I got a good sense of who B.B. King was listening to this album.
I think your dog likes this album too, Josh.
Damn it. I was hoping you guys wouldn't hear that.
Post-production edit right there. So
I would also say it was interesting. I think I was maybe into the second song, like 2 minutes before I realized I was in the second song, because it's one of those things that just blends. One goes right into the other. It's like a very fluid kind of, presentation. And yeah, this would be a blast to see live. Again, blues isn't my but how could you? It's one of those things. How could you? Well, how do you think you could be at the show and not enjoy yourself?
This is music that was basically designed to be played live. And we've listened to a lot of music that in the 60s that wasn't always designed to be played live, because it became like the album fetishization, which is great in its own way. I like that. But, this is not – this was an album that came later after the live show, and there's a difference with that, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know a ton of B.B. King stuff, but my guess is that he would take that guitar tone and use that throughout the rest of his career, and And
well, he used it for a long time before this too. Like,
right. Well,
Josh
that's the
said
thing
he's
too.
39,
Josh is 39. I that surprises me. I would have thought that he would have been, much younger. I don't. I just didn't have a concept of how old he was. But yeah, the song that I really liked the vocals was actually, it might have been the same. The How Blue Can You Get? Because I think that's where the Primitive Radio Gods thing comes in. I'm always going to think of I'm going to associate the two of them together now forever.
I'm just baffled that's what the hook was. And it's like, oh, well, I was lukewarm on this till crappy one-hit wonder song really resonated with my feels.
It has nothing to do with take, because that's not that, whatever. It's just like a generic, song from the 90s, but it's I just noticed it right away. But when he screams out that gave you 7 children and now you take them all back, and he's screaming, I was like, yeah.
Well, and the audience as well. It's like a visceral, yeah,
that was great.
Yeah.
He manages to straddle the audience too, that he's playing to the men and then he's playing to the women and he's going back and forth, and you feel that both parties are not being reluctantly drawn into what he's saying. He's giving both of them the nectar, so to speak, that gets them involved and almost playing creative tension off of each other, but in a good way.
Yeah, and even though they're singing the blues, man, everybody up here is having fun. This is just it's just been a fun show to be at.
Mm-hmm. Everyone can relate to the blues.
Yeah. Well, you don't like to as much as possible, but when you get there, you know what I mean? It's like then it works.
I do see what you're saying at the last song, Josh. It's almost like, because that's almost like the only non-blues sounding song on here. It's like it does stand out musically. It's almost like a samba type kind of thing going on. But yeah, John's probably right. The thematic aspect of that is, it makes it a little bit more cohesive, but it's still great.
Yeah, I agree. I can't say much. It's in some ways, I don't want to overtalk it because it is just standard straight ahead blues, and it's really solid standard straight ahead blues and really solid live music. And so if you enjoy the blues even tangentially, you enjoy live music, it also lengthwise is exactly the right length of how much you want. It doesn't, as I say often, it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's perfect. In fact, I would even argue I could have easily stomached another 2 or 3 tracks. I was enjoying it enough.
Yeah. And this, for reference, this is B.B. King's highest ranked album on Best Ever Albums. It was number 16 and 65 and number 163 of the 60s. So we didn't really come close to covering this on that list, but it's still great. I'm glad we were able to here.
Yeah.
It also, can I say one more thing too? Like when you look at the lyrics of "Help the Poor," one more thing to do that. It almost reads as like a religious sermon kind of in some ways, that you could see a hat being passed around the audience to collect to help the poor, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's what it was used for, but it easily, you could see it being like a let's pass the hat around and collect in some ways. So I mean, placement wise, that might be another reason it's there too. So any other final thoughts? We still have 2.5 minutes left if anybody wants to get anything in.
I don't think so. I think it's just, I was just probably taken by the, really liking something that traditionally is not something that I would say that I really like, straight up blues. So this was great.